I was taking a look at was a short bio about you, and I'm not sure how many of you understand his background, but you will shortly here. I'm going to give you the 1 minute quick bio, and then just so that you have that as a background. First, so you were born as a missionary kid in northern Thailand many years ago. And so you went to a missionary boarding school in the jungle in Malaysia. And then you went to high school in England while your parents were still in Thailand. And while you were in England in grade 11, at the age of 16, you felt God's call to be a missionary doctor. Okay? And we'll come back to that in a second. At age 17, you started medical school. You got your MD or MD equivalent at age 22. Finished surgeon school at age 26. We'll pause there for just a second. So earlier you were just talking about how God uses ordinary people. In looking at your biography, you don't seem like one of these ordinary people. This is pretty extraordinary, right? So, yeah, it's ordinary. Tell me why that's ordinary. Because many people look at this and say, whoa.
Well, maybe if in the UK, in the United Kingdom, that would be fairly standard practice. Finish high school at around about 17, 18 and go straight to medical school. We don't have to do 2 degrees to become an MD, so we can get through things a little quicker there. Okay. So for the UK, they read that, they said, yeah, so that's no different from anybody else. So just take it from me that it's very ordinary. Nothing extraordinary about it.
Okay. What is extraordinary, or maybe not so common, is feeling God's call at the age 16 to be a missionary doctor. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, when most of you have probably got past that point, when you get to the end of high school, you're got to think, what am I going to spend the rest of my life doing? Do I go to tertiary education, to college, or do I get a job? What am I going to do with the rest of my life? At least I kind of thought about that, but it hadn't made much of an impression on me. And I probably wouldn't have thought about it too much either, except that on one occasion, we were on a Sunday afternoon. We're walking, taking a short walk after, as we do in the United Kingdom. I don't know if you guys do it, but we always have a huge Sunday lunch with the roast potatoes and roast beef. And we always need to take a short walk to just to sort of, burp it out, digest. And I was visiting some friends, and their house happened to be in a part of Glasgow in Scotland that was very near a walk that is very well known in Scotland. You may not have heard it. It's called the West Highland Way, and it's a walk that runs up the whole west coast of Scotland for 90 miles. Now that's a long way in Scotland, because Scotland's so small. You could probably fit it into San Francisco, San Jose, that's all of Scotland. And it's a 90-mile walk. And a lot of people do it over the summer, take their tents and go camping, take about 5 or 6 days to do this walk through wonderful, beautiful scenery. And at the beginning of this path, we happened to be walking across it. And there, at the start of the path, as most origins of directions where you're going, was a signpost with the arrow pointing that this, if you wanted to walk this 90-mile walk, this is the way you go, follow this path, and there was an arrow there. Now, we were not going to walk 90 miles on a Sunday afternoon, having just had a huge Sunday lunch.
Unless you had a really big lunch.
Indeed. But when we were walking towards the signpost, I realized that somebody had been there before me. Now, many hundreds of thousands have probably been there before me, but I knew one had, because there was some graffiti had been written on this beautifully carved signpost. And my suspicion is that the graffiti artist was probably a Christian, but I'm not sure if you're allowed to do graffiti if you're a Christian. The reason I suspect that was because the graffiti, what had been written, was a verse of scripture on the outside of this signpost, and it was a verse of scripture, and the verse was Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 16. And the words were, when you stand at the crossroads, ask of the good way, and having asked of it, walk therein. And we were literally on a little dirt path, but it was a bit of a dirt crossroads. And here I was at 16 and a half, and it was as if the Holy Spirit opened my eyes and said, you're at the crossroads of your life. You're at a key point in your life. What are you going to do with it? You can make something of it, or you can waste it, right? Doing nothing, achieving nothing, or you can follow God and serve Him. And the verse says, when you stand at the crossroads of life, ask of the good way, God's way. And then having asked of it, don't ignore it. It says, and walk therein, or walk in that way that is the good way. What is God's way? And I realized that I had to find out what it was that God wanted me to do. And the final bit of that verse, which he hadn't actually written because there wasn't enough room on the signpost, but when I went home and read it, in the Bible it says, and you will find peace, or rest. Some versions say rest. And I realized I had to go away and find out, what did God want me to do with my life? And I think we all have to do that at some point. The younger, the better. Otherwise we end up at 30, 40 thinking, what have I done with my life? And God so wants to use our potential. So I went home, still hadn't a clue what I wanted to do. But I saw that sign, saw the verse, and I realized if I want to do something with my life, I've got to give it to God. And let God lead me and direct me so that He, not me, but God will use my life in something that will, in His purposes, not my purposes. And I went home, and two things happened shortly after that that guided me to become a medical missionary. The first was there was an accident in the Mandarin Christian Hospital in central Thailand where 14 of the missionaries serving as doctors and nurses were in a head-on collision and died in an instant. And suddenly half the doctors and nurses that were running this mission hospital were killed outright. So one whole family was killed, mother, father, child as well. And suddenly they needed doctors. And here I was, 16 and a half, I was still at high school, thinking they need doctors. Oh, they needed them instantly, and I couldn't go, of course. The second thing that happened just at that time was my grandfather gave me his handwritten diary of his life as he had lived it. And he was in his 70s by this time. But there were two things that impressed me about his life as I read through this. The first was he was a doctor. He had trained to be a doctor, and he was, as I was reading through it, he was trained to be a surgeon at Glasgow Royal Infirmary. You probably haven't heard of it here, but it was where Professor Lister worked. Now Lister was a very famous surgeon who said to us, you need to wash your hands and use antiseptic lotion before you operate, otherwise your patients will die and get infected. Simple, we all know it now, wash your hands, but back then it was kind of like revolutionary. And so it was a well-known, well-recognized surgical center with a great reputation, if not in Scotland, certainly in Europe, in the European areas as well. And my grandfather was working at this hospital where there was a chair, professorship, and they had said to him, look, they noticed how he was operating, how a good doctor he was, and he said, look, work hard, we can see you as a future professor here in this center, one of the leading surgical centers in the country. Well, what a thing to aspire to. Somebody's saying to you, you could be a professor here, your career is kind of mapped out, set out. But the other thing, as I was reading through his story, that impressed me was that not only was he heading for a professorship, which is slightly different in the UK. I think everybody, once you get to the top of your post, becomes professors here. But over in the UK, you might have, in the whole country, there might be just 2 professors. You'll have 5,000 doctors, but only 2 professors. Professors is like the elite of the elite. You must understand that. We're here, I think everybody's a professor who gets, it seems to me, everybody's introduced as professor, but when we translate it into our United Kingdom British, okay, you're just a general doctor, we understand who you are now. I'm not degrading your professors here.
Sure.
They're all very intelligent, I'm sure.
Yeah, lots of schooling, 2 degrees.
But a professorship back in the UK is kind of like, you know, becoming like the president, you know, of America. There's not many posts, there's very few. So he was lined up for this. But the other thing that impressed me was, that might not impress you, but it impressed me, was that he was playing rugby for the Scottish national team. Now that's kind of like playing American football and getting to the Super Bowl every year, okay? Is that the equivalent? Maybe it's not. It's to play basketball for the United States of America at the Olympics. You know, that's this caliber, okay? So you're at the top of your game. You're playing for your country, and every young Scottish boy wants to wear that navy blue rugby outfit and run on to the national stadium pitch and play for Scotland. And he was playing, and his pictures was in the newspapers almost daily because he was scoring tries or touchdowns, you would call them, for the national team. So he was, in his career, he was heading for academic recognition. In his free time, out of hours, he was playing rugby for Scotland. And I thought, man, he's got the best of everything here. Security, income, fame, fortune. And as the story progressed in his handwritten diary, he threw it all away. And he went to China to become a surgeon in interior China, Honan. He threw away all that fame and fortune. And I thought, wow. And I knew my grandfather, a 70-year-old man now, and was just blown over by this amazing, peaceful, and yet confident, and yet totally happy man who seemed to know the answers to everything. And here he had left to go to China, and I thought, here is a man who seems so wise to me, has chosen being unknown, unrecognition, but serving God, far greater than what we in the world would elevate and see as greater. And I said, man, if it's that good, I want a part of it. I want to be involved in that too. And so I decided that if it's being a medical missionary is that great, then I want to do it. And so I headed off decided I was going to go to medical school. So that was where. But it was this sense that we need to decide, what is it that God wants us to do? When you stand at the crossroads of your life, and sometimes we come to those crossroads frequently in our lives, don't we? Sometimes it's when we're 18 and we leave school. Sometimes then it's when we're 24, 25 when we leave college and we've got to decide. Sometimes it's, you know, who am I going to marry? You come to another crossroads. But these are important decisions. It says, ask of the good way and walk therein. And that's so important in our lives, every step of our way. To ask God, what do you want me to do? How can I serve you?
Now, did your father or grandfather try to discourage you from that path of being a missionary doctor? Did they encourage that?
I had encouragement all the way. My father was a missionary in Thailand, and my father was an MK because my grandfather was a missionary. My father was born in China.
A missionary kid.
MK is a missionary kid, yeah. So my father was born in China. He grew up in China before he came and then had to leave and would go to Thailand. And my grandfather, he was born in China because my great-grandfather was a missionary in China as well. Since 1885, my 4 generations ago have been missionaries in a direct line. So they kind of were not putting me off, you know, in the bloodline, you know. It was almost, you can't be anything else, you know.
Don't shame the family.
They were, you know, complicit in my going and so keen that I went.
So you, I guess, went along this route with pretty informed understanding of what that might look like.
Might be. Absolutely. You know, when I grew up as a kid in Thailand, I don't know that I understood everything at the time, because when you're young, you don't. But I remember my dad, when he was in South Thailand, and he would be out in the villages doing evangelism, and he would come back and tell us stories. One of the stories, he came back at the one night and he said, you know, he got a call the night before to go to a village to help a person, and some of the Christians there had one of the villagers had called some of the Christians over because they had gone basically crazy. And they had got a knife in their hand and got to run around attacking some of the villagers. And the Christians didn't know what to do with this person. Neither did the non-Christians in the village. And there was absolute, but they had tied this guy to the center post of this wooden house. They'd managed to tie him. And they called my dad, because he was the missionary. Would they come and help? This was like 10 o'clock at night. So he traveled out to this village. And when he got there, he noticed this guy was tied, bound very tightly. The knife had been taken away from him, but he had large cuts on his body. And he was clearly ranting and raving. And the locals said he's demon-possessed. And my dad said, well, maybe he's just epileptic, or maybe it's something, psychiatric illness. They weren't quite sure, but they said, well, we have tried everything. We've called the witch doctor in, nothing's happening. We can't get him to settle down. And they said, you're the missionary, pray for him. And the dad's sort of thinking, well, okay, we're put on the spot a little bit. But he then says to them, well, I don't necessarily understand what's going on, but he explained to them, we will pray, but you've got to understand, it's not me, it's God is going to work one way or another. And he began to pray. Prayed that whatever was causing the problems in this person, that he would be freed from it and overcome. And after praying and leading everybody else to pray, Christians and non-Christians there, the man suddenly began to become quiet and relaxed and stopped fighting against the ties, the ropes that were around him. And what my dad said at the time was an interesting thing happened, that he realized that this must have been demon possession, was because these huge cuts, he hadn't realized, he wasn't medical, but once they were praying for the healing of this person, and if there was a spirit for it to come out, suddenly these huge deep cuts, blood started pouring out, which hadn't before, and the guy settled down. And eventually he sort of came to, and it was quite clear that that this had been a demon's possession. Now these were stories that I grew up with. Now I didn't think much of them, they were kind of normal stories that we were hearing from day to day. But when I got home and realized that you know, you face real life problems at home. So I grew up with these stories and stories of my grandfather and things that God had done in their lives, that it was almost sort of a natural thing that it's okay to trust God no matter what happens, because he's going to be with you.
So along the way, studying to be a doctor, and on your way to the mission field, what doubts or second thoughts did you have along the way, and how were you sure that that's what God had for you?
For me, the most clear way was that there were times when the door seemed shut, and it looked like, man, it seemed God is calling me there, but I can't get there. And God frequently opened the door. And for me, that was how he confirmed in my mind. When I had decided I was going to become a medical missionary, and I applied to medical school, and the system in the UK was that you couldn't apply to every medical school. You could apply to 5. So I applied to 5. And the 5 returned the reply, no, we don't want you to come. I got 5 refusals to go to medical school. And so we were allowed a 6th attempt. I applied to a 6th medical school, and they said, no, we don't want you. So here I was thinking, God, I thought you told me to go to medical school, but I can't even get into medical school. And so at that point we had to wait for our exam results, like our SAT scores, I guess, in this country. Once you get your SAT scores out, you can then take those SAT scores and take them back to the medical school and say, hey, I've done okay, do you want me? And the system was called, in the UK anyway, clearing. That was because everybody now had got their places at college, but some people had applied 2 places, so there were spaces left. So they tied it up. Everybody that was left over, which was me, one of them, went to the university and said, have you got any spaces left that are vacant? Hey, I'm free, you can take me, it would be a privilege for you to have me come and study at college. And went through this clearing process, and all the medical school says, no thanks, we don't want you. And college was about to start, a week before college was going to start. Nobody wanted me. And I thought, what's going on? Am I supposed to be a doctor? I thought God had said be a doctor, but it looked like the doors were shutting. What do you do? So much so that my father bought a book, a huge book, and it was an A to Z of careers. 10,000 careers. Started with the letter A. Accountant, architect, airline pilot, all the way through to Z. 10,000 jobs. And he said, sit down and read it. Choose one of these. And so I went through it from A to Z, 500 pages, whatever it was. And he said, right, what have you decided? I said, I want to be a doctor. He said, you can't, nobody wants you. So I decided, well, choose something else. It looked like this was back in the 1980s. And so I thought, well, let's study computers, which was kind of thought, is that the big thing? Of course, we know it is. We didn't know that at the time. And so within a week of college starting, I said, well, if I'm going to have to do something, let's study computers. And came home, having been away with my father, and my mother had been at home, and this medical school must have been desperate, but they phoned up my mother and said, does Scott Murray still want a place at medical school? One guy's dropped out at the last minute. Does he want it? And so she had accepted, my mother had accepted. I said, yes, he'll take it. Back from this holiday. And I said, but I want to study computers now. But she said, well, they've accepted you. So no, but there's no accommodation. All you've got is a place, that's it. You've got no scholarship, you've got nothing. You just get there in 4 days' time and you can study medicine. I thought, well, that's great. I'll take a tent, I'll stay anywhere. Got there, didn't know anybody in this town, not a soul, but some church contacts. So they said, look, there's a young fella who's in the church there and he'll put you up on the floor. You can stay there until you can find something else. And arrived there 2 days later. College is like starting in 2 or 3 days, and there's a letter there from the university medical school saying somebody has vacated their residence. If you want it, take it. You got our answers today. And so within 4 or 5 days of having no place at medical school, what seemed impossible, God made possible. And the door opened to study medicine, and the accommodation that I was given was right next to. You could almost hear the professors preparing their lectures. We were that close, right next to the lecture theatres and so on. So, and when I got to the medical school, I realized that their entrance qualifications for the medical school are pretty high, as you know. I guess it would be about 2,200, 2,300 for a SAT score. And my scores were just underneath that, but God opened the door. What seemed impossible, God made possible. And for me, that was confirmation that God was saying, don't worry, everything's in control. I'll get you there, just trust me. So those were really how I knew that it was the right thing to do. That even though at times there were obstacles, there were obstructions, but God opened the door, and I knew that was the right thing to do. Go through it.
Excellent. Quick time check. Pastor Tim, what time are we going until?
About 25 after.
Okay. All right. We'll leave some time for questions and answers, but maybe for the next few minutes I can ask a few other things here. Okay. During this morning's message, one of the things that he said was that God has authority to disrupt our lives. And I wanted to understand, how has this been true in your life?
Well, first, when I was studying to be a doctor and then a surgeon, people said to me, my colleagues said to me, you're crazy. Why on earth do you want to go? You're losing a good job, security back home, pension, and everything like that. And so in one sense, God will come in and sometimes say, leave your family, leave your friends, leave everything behind and trust me. And you may say, but hold on a minute. Let me get my pension sorted out first. Let me make sure that my elderly mother and father are okay. But God says, go. And And so if he calls you, if he has the authority, and he has the right to say, go and move. And we sometimes get so upset and uptight. And so I'm talking from that point of view. For me, he can make things awkward for you, if you like, although he's got his life planned out. And I can say to you now that after 23 years in the mission field, that you live on a missionary stipend, but we have never been without. We have always, always. There was a time when certainly my parents, I can think of many stories. The story that comes to mind was when I was a young fellow with my parents in North Thailand. The donations from churches back home would come every 3 months. It wasn't a lot, but they would come every 3 months. And there was one 3-month period where no money came at all. The mission said, we have no money to send you. And my parents, 4 children, and my parents were up in North Thailand. No money had come in. And in that 3 months, they ate better. They were better fed, better clothed in that 3 months. And you say, well, how did that happen when they had no money came in? While they had been serving as missionaries in that village, people had got sick. So they had helped them. They'd sometimes take them down to the hospital, down to get further treatment. Or they had helped people when they were building new houses, or helped them in one various way. And in that 3 months, God moved people to provide for their needs. They said, oh, we remember you helped when you took us down to the hospital and treated us and we've got over our malaria. And they said, oh, here's 2 chickens. We didn't have a lot of money in the village. So somebody else came and said, oh, we've just had a great harvest. Here's a sack of rice. Other people came and said, well, there was a tailor who'd just come to know Christ through their ministry. And he said, right, come down to my shop and I'll make you clothes. And for those 3 months, and actually for the rest of the time that we were there, for the next 5 years, this tailor made us handmade clothes we never had to pay for. And during that time when it seemed like there was, how do you survive? In fact, my father said to me, during that time, they didn't even have enough money to buy a stamp, to put on an envelope. Had they even wanted to write home and ask for help, they couldn't, because they didn't even have the money for a stamp. And yet, in that 3 months, they said, we ate better, we had better clothes, we were more satisfied than in any other time before, because God moved and stepped in. So sometimes we say, well, hold on a minute, God's calling you to go somewhere, and you say, oh, no, I'm not ready. I need to, get security, financial security. God says go. And we may think, but how? How is this all going to work out? He will. And after 23 years, there's not a moment that I would say in that verse it says, and you will have peace. You may not have free of problems, but you'll have peace as God provides for every need.
Thanks for that testimony. And as an encouragement to all of you listening here, consider for yourself, is there something that God's been impressing on your heart, that you have felt perhaps in the past that God has called you to, where maybe you have lost faith along the way? Pray and see how God might be faithful to what He's called you to.